For 3,000 years, Egypt stood as the definition of permanence. While empires rose and fell around it, while civilizations appeared and vanished, Egypt endured. The pyramids watched centuries pass. The Nile flooded and receded in eternal rhythm. Pharaohs claimed to be living gods, and for millennia, the world believed them. Then, in the span of just 350 years, it all fell apart. By 332 BCE, when Alexander the Great marched into Egypt, the age of the pharaohs was over. Not ended by a single catastrophic defeat, not destroyed in one dramatic collapse, but eroded piece by piece, invasion by invasion, until nothing remained but the monuments of a dead civilization. How does the world's oldest continuous empire, a civilization that survived for longer than the entire history of Christianity, simply cease to exist? The answer isn't a single event. It's a cascade of failures, economic collapse, environmental disaster, internal corruption, and foreign invasions by enemies who learned that the eternal empire could bleed. This is the story of Egypt's long death, a 350-year decline from the death of Ramesses XI in 1077 BCE to Alexander's conquest in 332 BCE, the fall of the last great Bronze Age civilization. And it started with a pharaoh who couldn't control his own kingdom. When Ramesses XI died in 1077 BCE, Egypt was already broken. The new kingdom, Egypt's golden age of conquest and wealth, had been sustained by tribute from vassal states, gold from Nubian mines, and the prestige of military power. But by the end of Ramses XI's reign, all of that was gone. The Sea People's invasions had destroyed Egypt's trading partners. Syria, once an Egyptian vassal, was independent. The Hittite Empire had collapsed. The Mediterranean economy had shattered. Egypt survived, barely. But it emerged from the Bronze Age collapse, isolated and impoverished. Worse, the pharaoh no longer controlled his own country. During Ramses XI's final years, Egypt had effectively split in two. In the north, the pharaoh ruled from Tanis. In the south, the high priest of Amun at Thebes controlled Upper Egypt like an independent kingdom. The priests had become as powerful as the pharaoh. The temples owned 1/3 of Egypt's farmland. They controlled vast treasuries. They commanded their own armies. When Ramesses XI died, there was no strong successor to reunite the kingdom. Instead, Egypt fragmented into the Third Intermediate Period, nearly 4 centuries of division, foreign rule, and slow decline. The first to exploit Egypt's weakness were its former subjects, the Libyans. For centuries, Libyan tribes had served as mercenaries in Egypt's armies. They'd settled in the Nile Delta, integrating into Egyptian society while maintaining their own identity. And as Egyptian power weakened, these military settlers saw an opportunity. Around 945 BCE, a Libyan military commander named Shoshenq seized power and established the 22nd dynasty, not through conquest, but through marriage alliances and political maneuvering within Egypt's own elite. This was the first time in Egypt's history that foreigners ruled as pharaohs. Shoshenq tried to restore Egypt's glory. He even launched a military campaign into Palestine, raiding Jerusalem during the reign of King Rehoboam, the campaign mentioned in the Bible. But it was hollow grandeur. Egypt no longer had the resources for sustained empire. The campaign was a raid, not a conquest. And when Shoshenq died, his dynasty couldn't hold the kingdom together. By 800 BCE, Egypt had fractured again. Multiple pharaohs claimed the throne simultaneously. Local dynasties ruled different cities. Thebes was independent. The delta was divided among competing rulers. Egypt wasn't a unified kingdom anymore. It was a collection of city-states wearing the costume of empire. And to the south, in Nubia, someone was watching. For 1,000 years, Nubia had been Egypt's colony. Egyptian pharaohs had built fortresses along the Nile, extracted Nubia's gold, and treated Nubians as subjects. But as Egypt fractured, Nubia unified. By 750 BCE, the kingdom of Kush, centered at Napata in modern Sudan, had become a regional power, and its rulers had adopted Egyptian culture completely. They worshipped Egyptian gods, they built pyramids, they wrote in hieroglyphs. The Nubian kings believed they were more Egyptian than the Egyptians. In their eyes, the divided pharaohs of the Delta had abandoned Ma'at. The Egyptian concept of cosmic order and justice. The true Egyptian tradition was now preserved in Nubia. So, around 744 BCE, the Nubian king Piye decided to restore Egypt by conquering it. Piye's invasion was framed as a religious mission. He marched north with his army, declaring that he was saving Egypt from chaos, restoring the proper worship of Amun, and reuniting the two lands under rightful rule. One by one, the Delta pharaohs submitted. Those who resisted were crushed. By 728 BCE, Piye controlled all of Egypt. For the first time in its history, Egypt was ruled by black African pharaohs from the south. The 25th dynasty, the Nubian dynasty, had begun. And surprisingly, they were good rulers. The Nubian pharaohs restored temples. They revived old religious ceremonies. They styled themselves as traditional Egyptian kings while maintaining their Nubian identity. Under their rule, Egypt experienced a cultural renaissance. But there was a problem. Egypt's enemies had evolved. While Egypt had been declining, a new superpower had risen in Mesopotamia. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, the most brutal, most efficient military machine the ancient world had ever seen. And Assyria was expanding west. The Assyrians didn't care about Egyptian traditions or religious legitimacy. They cared about conquest, tribute, and the annihilation of anyone who resisted them. By 720 BCE, Assyria controlled Syria and Palestine, territories Egypt had once dominated. When the Nubian pharaohs tried to support rebellions against Assyrian rule, offering aid to cities like Jerusalem, Assyria decided Egypt needed to be taught a lesson. In 701 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib crushed an Egyptian-backed rebellion. The Nubian pharaoh Taharka sent an army to help defend Jerusalem. The Assyrians destroyed it. But this was just a warning. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt itself. The Nubian pharaohs had restored Egyptian culture, but they hadn't restored Egyptian military power. Egypt's army was outdated, still fighting with bronze weapons and chariots, while Assyria fielded iron-armed infantry and siege engines. Esarhaddon's forces swept through the delta. They captured Memphis, Egypt's ancient capital. They forced Taharka to flee south to Thebes. For the first time in its 3,000-year history, Egypt's heartland was occupied by a foreign army. Taharka tried to reclaim the north. He launched a counterattack and briefly retook Memphis, but the Assyrians returned with overwhelming force. In 664 BCE, Esarhaddon's successor Ashurbanipal launched a devastating campaign. His army marched all the way to Thebes, the sacred city that had never fallen to a foreign enemy, and they sacked it. The destruction of Thebes sent shockwaves through the ancient world. This was Egypt's holiest city, home to the great temple of Karnak, the burial place of pharaohs. And the Assyrians looted it, burned it, and carried its treasures back to Nineveh. The Nubian dynasty was finished. Taharqa and his successor retreated permanently to Nubia, where their descendants would rule for another 1,000 years, but never again in Egypt. The Assyrians installed an Egyptian puppet ruler named Psamtik I to govern in their name, but the Assyrians had overextended themselves. Their empire was vast but fragile, and when Assyria fell into civil war, Psamtik saw his chance. Psamtik I did something remarkable. He reunified Egypt and made it independent again. By 676 BCE, he'd expelled Assyrian forces and consolidated control over the entire Nile Valley. He established the 26th dynasty, the Sete dynasty, named after his capital at Sais in the Delta. For over a century, Egypt experienced one last revival. The Sete pharaohs reformed the military, hiring Greek mercenaries and modernizing tactics. They restored trade networks. They built monuments. There was even a cultural movement looking back to Egypt's glorious past. Scholars studied Old Kingdom texts. Artists copied ancient styles. It was a deliberate attempt to reclaim Egyptian identity after centuries of foreign domination. But it was built on a fragile foundation. Egypt's economy was weaker than ever. The farmland had degraded from centuries of neglect. The population had shrunk. The gold mines in Nubia were lost. Trade had declined, and the world was changing in ways Egypt couldn't control. In 539 BCE, a new superpower emerged, the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Within 20 years, Persia conquered Babylon, Lydia, and the Greek cities of Ionia. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen, and Egypt was next on the list. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt with a massive army. Pharaoh Psamtik III, grandson of the dynasty's founder, tried to stop them at the Battle of Pelusium. The Egyptians fought desperately, but the Persian army was too large, too well organized, too disciplined. Egypt's army was shattered. Psamtik III was captured. The Persian army marched to Memphis without resistance. Egypt had become a Persian province, a satrapy ruled by a foreign governor. The pharaohs were finished. For the next 2 centuries, Egypt would struggle between Persian occupation and brief periods of independence, each one shorter than the last. The Persians ruled Egypt as conquerors, not as pharaohs. They extracted tribute, stationed garrisons, and viewed Egypt as a resource to fund their wars against Greece. Some Persian kings made token gestures toward Egyptian culture. Darius I completed Egyptian temple projects and portrayed himself in pharaonic style. But the Egyptians knew the truth. They were subjects, not citizens of their own land. In 404 BCE, as Persia fought Greece in the west and dealt with internal rebellions, Egypt revolted. Native Egyptian rulers briefly reclaimed independence. The 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties ruling from different delta cities. But these were desperate, fragmented regimes constantly preparing for the inevitable Persian return. The last native pharaoh was Nectanebo II, who ruled from 360 to 343 BCE. He fortified Egypt's borders. He built massive defensive walls. He hired tens of thousands of Greek mercenaries. It wasn't enough. In 343 BCE, the Persian king Artaxerxes III invaded with an overwhelming force. Nectanebo's defenses crumbled. The pharaoh fled to Nubia with whatever treasure he could carry. Egypt was Persian again. But this time, the Persians showed no mercy. Temples were looted. Cities were punished. Persian rule was harsher than ever. For the next decade, Egypt suffered under brutal occupation. And then, in 332 BCE, a 25-year-old Macedonian king appeared on Egypt's borders, Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt in 332 BCE, he didn't have to conquer it. The Egyptians welcomed him. After a decade of Persian oppression, Alexander was seen as a liberator. Persian forces in Egypt barely resisted, most simply abandoned their posts. Alexander marched into Memphis without a battle. The Egyptian priests proclaimed him pharaoh. He performed the proper religious ceremonies. He made offerings to Egyptian gods. And the Egyptians celebrated because they believed he would restore their independence. They were wrong. Alexander had no interest in Egyptian traditions beyond using them for legitimacy. He stayed in Egypt for only 6 months, just long enough to found Alexandria, consult the oracle at Sueva, and secure Egypt's grain supply for his larger campaigns. Then he left to conquer Persia, and Egypt became a Macedonian province. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, one of his generals, Ptolemy, seized Egypt and established his own dynasty. The Ptolemaic dynasty would rule Egypt for the next 3 centuries, until Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE. But make no mistake, the Ptolemies were Greek, not Egyptian. They spoke Greek. They ruled from Greek-style Alexandria. They viewed native Egyptians as subjects. The age of the Pharaohs, the 3,000-year tradition of Egyptian rule over Egypt, had ended. By the time Rome annexed Egypt in 30 BCE, Egyptian civilization had been dead for centuries. The language was fading. The religion was syncretized with Greek gods. The monuments were tourist attractions, not living temples. Egypt had become a museum of its own past. So what killed Egypt? Why did a civilization that survived for 3 millennia suddenly collapse? The answer is, it didn't collapse suddenly. It eroded over 350 years through a combination of factors that reinforced each other until recovery became impossible. First, economic decline. Egypt's wealth came from agricultural surplus and trade, but the Bronze Age collapse destroyed Egypt's trading partners. The loss of Nubian gold mines eliminated a crucial revenue source. Centuries of Nile flood irregularities, possibly linked to climate shifts, reduced agricultural yields. By 700 BCE, Egypt was simply poorer than it had been during the New Kingdom. And a poorer Egypt couldn't maintain the massive armies needed to defend its borders. Second, political fragmentation. The rise of the Amun priesthood created a state within a state. When central authority weakened, Egypt split into competing power centers that couldn't unite against external threats. Every time Egypt reunified under the Libyans, the Nubians, the Scythes, it was temporary. The structural problems remained. Third, military obsolescence. Egypt's military hadn't evolved since the Bronze Age. While Assyria developed iron weapons, siege engines, and professional armies, Egypt still relied on conscripted farmers and mercenaries. By the time Egyptian rulers tried to modernize, hiring Greek mercenaries in the Scythe period, their enemies had already leapfrogged them technologically and organizationally. Fourth, geopolitical isolation. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, but it emerged isolated. All of its old allies and rivals had been destroyed or transformed. Egypt couldn't build new alliances because it had nothing to offer. When new superpowers emerged, Assyria, Persia, Macedon, Egypt was strategically irrelevant except as a source of grain. Fifth, the weight of tradition. Ironically, Egypt's greatest strength, its cultural continuity, became a weakness. Egyptian elites were so invested in maintaining traditional forms that they couldn't adapt quickly enough to changing circumstances. Even as Egypt was conquered repeatedly, pharaohs kept building in ancient styles, performing ancient ceremonies, pretending they still ruled as gods. The rituals continued even as the reality crumbled. Egypt's collapse teaches us something profound about civilizations. Longevity doesn't guarantee immortality. For 3,000 years, Egypt's stability made it seem eternal. The Nile would always flood. The pharaoh would always be divine. The pyramids would always stand. But civilizations aren't static. They're living systems that must constantly adapt to survive. And Egypt, for all its grandeur, couldn't adapt fast enough. When the Bronze Age world collapsed, Egypt survived, but it never fully recovered. Each subsequent crisis weakened it further. Each foreign invasion proved that the god kings could be defeated. Each period of division made reunification harder. By the time Alexander arrived, Egypt was already a shadow of itself. Alexander didn't destroy Egyptian civilization. He just formalized what had already happened. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE, over 7 centuries after the last native pharaoh. People were still worshipping Egyptian gods, but they were doing it in Greek, in Roman-style temples, under foreign rulers. Egyptian civilization didn't end with a bang. It faded layer by layer until only the monuments remained. And those monuments, the pyramids, the temples, the tombs, they weren't meant to commemorate Egypt's fall. They were built to last forever, to ensure Egypt would never be forgotten. In that sense, at least, the pharaohs succeeded. 3,000 years after the last true Egyptian pharaoh died, we still remember Egypt, still study its language, still marvel at its monuments. But the empire fell. But the civilization? That's immortal. If this deep dive into how the world's oldest empire finally fell got you thinking about the fragility of even the greatest civilizations, you're in the right place. Here at Imperial Echoes, we explore the rises and falls that shaped human history, from empires that lasted millennia to kingdoms that collapsed in a generation. The patterns of power, the lessons of decline, and the echoes that still influence our world today. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications for more videos on ancient civilizations, forgotten empires, and the turning points that changed everything. We've got documentaries coming on the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome, and why every great empire eventually falls. Drop a comment. What do you think killed Egypt? Was it economic collapse, military weakness, or something else? Could Egypt have survived if it had adapted differently? And if you want to understand how civilizations actually die, not through dramatic battles, but through slow erosion, check out our other videos on imperial decline and the cost of clinging to tradition too long. Because Egypt's lesson is clear. Nothing lasts forever, not even things that last 3,000 years. Thanks for watching. History remembers both the empires that rose and the empires that fell, and we're here to tell both stories.